students from schools in the area, high schools. We want to welcome you. We also want to welcome anybody from the general public that's here. I especially would like to acknowledge Michaela Grover. I know some of your students are here. Are there German students here? We're getting, they don't want to be there.
There are some.
There are some. And we're glad to have you here. I'm especially thankful to Michaela for arranging Paula Birnbaum to not only speak in the lecture series, but to have presented a wonderful lecture earlier in the month, in February, and also to Ann Weber and Anna, I didn't get your last name, from the Goethe Institute, which is the organization for German culture in the Bay Area, and they are the people who have arranged for this exhibit to come to Northern California. So, go over here to read my notes and introduce the speaker. We also have some people who have been very involved and active in the community. Al and Suzanne Batsdorf are here visiting with us, as is Hank Cohen, who you spent some time with earlier in the semester, and Hans Brett, who is also a member of the community. And if I forgot someone, please excuse me. Okay. Now I would like to introduce our speaker for today. Paula Birnbaum is Assistant Professor of Art History and Arts Management, Chair of the Visual Arts Department at the University of San Francisco. She holds a doctorate in art history from Bryn Mawr College and has received research fellowships from the Fulbright Foundation, as well as the Institute for Research on Women and Gender at Stanford University. At USF, she teaches a variety of classes, including modern and contemporary art, women and art, and museum studies. And she runs the Art Management Internship Program. And that program prepares students for professional careers in the art field. Her research focuses on how gender, ethnicity, social class, and sexual orientation have affected women artists' self-representation, with Jewish identity as a particular area of her interest. She's presently completing a book entitled Framing Femininity, and it explores a group of international women artists who exhibited their work together in Paris between the world wars. A new essay on the digitally inspired embroidered samplers of contemporary artist Elaine Reichek will appear in Art Journal and Modern Visual Culture, representing Africans and Jews, published by Routledge. And then The Modern Woman Revisited with Rutgers, and she has also written for a variety of journals. This particular lecture is a part of a celebration of Women's History Month. So would you all welcome Paula Birnbaum.
Thank you, Myrna, for the lovely introduction. And I would like to thank Myrna Goodman for putting together this class and series. I can't believe it's been going for 25 years. You all are so lucky to be focusing so intensively on this very important chapter in world history and learning about genocide as we, are into the 21st century, and so many people who survived the tragedy of the Holocaust are no longer with us. There are very few left, and it's up to you guys, the younger generation, to keep this history alive and to really understand the importance of communicating it to people younger than yourselves. I'd also like to thank Professor Michaela Goebbels from the German Modern Language Department for inviting me earlier in February to speak, and as well as the German club at the university here. Also Karen Brodsky from the library and the University Library Associates. Professor Jennifer Shaw from Art History, and Anna Weber, who's here from the Goethe Institute in San Francisco, and her fantastic intern, Hannah Bigleri, who really helped me figure out the translations to the text. So thank you very much. So can I have the room darkened, please? Thank you. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is really talk to you in detail about the work of Charlotte Solomon, and also bring her work to the present and what is the legacy of artists who have responded to the Holocaust in their work in a contemporary context. So Solomon, for those of you who don't know, was a young German Jewish artist from Berlin, who created a fantastic visual diary, over 1,300 watercolors. The material is called gouache, that eventually was condensed into about 700, that she called Leben oder Theater, or Life or Theater, between the years of 1940 and 1942, when she was only between 23 and 25 years old, so the age of many of you sitting here. And she did this when she was a refugee in the south of France, just outside of Nice. And the title of this work, Life or Theater, poses a great existential question. Is all life, in fact, a performance? We see this beautiful young woman, possessed as an artist. In spite of tremendous persecution and war, she was driven to create an assessment of her past and to really explore the meaning of her existence. The work, as you'll see, documents her life in Berlin and then France during the rise of Hitler's regime, before her murder in 1943 by the Nazis in the death camp of Auschwitz. It's an amazingly powerful watercolor about life, death, and the will to persist under harrowing obstacles. You'll see Charlotte's sophisticated awareness of art history, music history, literature, and literary devices, all in a multimedia work of art. Some of you have probably read Anne Frank, maybe even for this class, her diary, written when she was a teenager. You might think of Solomon's work as a visual, not equivalent, but a similar work of stature in a visual form, made in her early 20s. And I want you to think throughout my lecture about the role of the memoir or the journal. Some of you keep diaries, I'm sure. How is it a strategy for someone during a time of war, someone who feels that they don't fit in? How does writing your life, in the end, make you feel like you're saving it? How do you leave your mark and tell a particular story that will persist long after you're gone? And how do you negotiate those boundaries between private, your diary that you don't want anyone to see, and public, knowing that they may live well after you? Solomon was born in 1917 in Berlin to fairly affluent parents. Her father was a surgeon and medical school professor. Her mother died when she was a young girl, 9 years old, and she was told as a child that it was from a bad case of the flu. But she learns only much later in her life, as we'll see in the visual diary, of a terrible family history of major depression and suicide. Her mother, when she was 9, her aunt, whose name was also Charlotte, when she was 18, committed suicide, and also her grandmother will commit suicide during the war in front of Charlotte. So a horrible, horrible family history of depression and feeling that all odds are stacked against you, on top of the history of anti-Semitism and the war. So this story is part personal, part political, negotiating her desire to live and work freely as a young Jewish woman artist, to fight this history of depression, to fight political oppression, and the tension that the series poses between the public and the private. I also wanted to just give you a working definition of cultural memory, which is in my title, my talk. So how are a group of people with a shared history, and this will be important when we look more at the contemporary artists, responding, in this case, to the Shoah, or the Holocaust, and identifying culturally in public ways? How are they perceiving themselves? What are the different theories of visualizing collective memory? How we distinguish between memory and history, and produce representations that connote time, space, and the body as a container or carrier of powerful memories. Now, one survivor, the Israeli writer Aaron Appelfeld, found that artistic expression seemed repellent immediately after the Holocaust. How can we make art, he said, when there's this desire to keep silence versus the desire to speak? And I quote, "Artistic expression after the Holocaust seemed repugnant, disgusting. The pain and suffering called either for silence or for wild outcries. Any embellishment or sweetening was jarring. Moreover, art, and not without reason, was linked in our minds with a sphere of European culture of which we had been the victims." So he goes on to argue that we need art. We need it to transmit this dreadful experience from the category of history into that of art. And there have been many, many books written about art and poetry, music that has come out of the experience of the Holocaust. So back to Leben oder Theater. Solomon was making this before the Holocaust, tracing the personal and collective experience of so many Jews who faced anti-Semitism. She calls this work a Singspiel, which you can see there. This is the title page, or a play carefully set to music. And this is a precursor to an operetta. And some images actually had overlays with tracing paper, with text written on the paper over the image. So it was a very sophisticated work of art. She also included very specific instructions about the musical selections that would be playing when you read the book. Beethoven's Ninth, Mozart, Bach, Carmen by Bizet, folk tunes. So it's very complicated. And this is, again, one of the first pages. Throughout the text, she refers to herself in the third person. All of the characters have ironic pseudonyms for real people in Solomon's life. So she refers to herself as Charlotte Kahn, the German Kahn, meaning I can do it. So there's a sense of activism here. Her grandparents she refers to as the Knarres, which can mean like a rattling sound. An annoying rattling sound. Her stepmother, who was a famous opera singer named Paula Lindbergh, who had changed her name from Levy, she refers to as Paulinka Birnbaum. So the Birnbaum comes like from a child's song, trying to evoke fairy tales, memories of more innocent times. And then Amadeus Daberlon was her lover, the real man called Albert Wolfson, who was her mother's voice teacher and a prominent voice in music in Germany in this time. So she's creating distance between herself and these characters by using them as sort of actors, staged with music, colors. It's almost like a movie-like narration. And she produced it very quickly with great determination. And when she was arrested in 1943 in the south of France by the Gestapo, she handed it to her neighbor, a physician, and said, "Here, take good care of this. C'est toute ma vie. It's my whole life in this book, and I entrust it to you," before going off to the concentration camp. Myrna said that my own background is actually in French art, and this is one of the artists that I have written about who was working at the same time, a little older than Charlotte, named Alice Halika. And it's a very different story of conformity and complete assimilation She was born with the name Rosenblatt. She changed her name to Halika to sound Polish and exotic. And actually, you may have heard in this class the term passing, or trying to assimilate and pass as Aryan or Christian. And Halika did just that. And she even took it so far as to produce images like this. She was commissioned to illustrate a novel by a Zionist author named Israel Zangwill. And she produced what I consider to be pretty typical anti-Semitic looking imagery, with the hooked noses and kind of bulbous faces, really kind of following the lead of the popular culture and cartoons. And people didn't know she was Jewish. So for Solomon to be kind of out in this piece, really exploring what's happening to her because she is Jewish, is really quite stunning for such a young woman to just embrace what is happening. So I want to walk you through some of the images fairly quickly to give you a sense of the power and beauty. This is one of the very first images, and this is the narrating the suicide of Charlotte's aunt, whose name was also Charlotte, at age 18. And as I said, all the women in her family shared this painful history. We get this almost Ophelia-like image, if you know pre-Raphaelite painting, late 19th century painting of her aunt who drowned herself in a lake. You might think of the work of Munch, very tragic. So this is before Charlotte, our main character, is born. And the early works, I want you to see the evolution of the style. They're very much more realistic. They have an almost medieval quality to them. Some of them show multiple scenes or periods of time in one page, which is a strategy in medieval art. And the later works are much more graphic. They look like they were made quickly. Harsh imagery. The people are barely recognizable. So this image is in your exhibit in the library, and this is, we go through the birth of our Charlotte, and this is her mother, who is on the verge of her death. And Charlotte, at the time, I mentioned, thought it was from the flu, and she writes, I put the text from Life Worth Theater on the slides here. Heaven is a lot nicer than earth, and when your mommy has become an angel, she will come down and bring the little rabbit a letter in which she will say what it is like in heaven above. So she's preparing her daughter, that she's thinking about death. And the musical direction here is to the melody of a song, The Candles Burn on the Christmas Tree. So we get the sense that this is a very assimilated household as well. There are lots of references to Christmas heaven. Jews typically don't believe in heaven. We see the window introduced here as a central symbol throughout the work that we will follow. The symbol of the mother's death. She jumped from a third-story window. So we're setting the stage here. Here is the image of the actual suicide. I cannot bear it any longer. I'm always so alone, says her mother. So the window now is both a stand-in for the mother, literally the gravity pulling the window down. And we see the grandmother standing watch on the top of the dark figure. And then the physical window that she actually jumped from. So the image is incredibly modern, conveys desperation, violence, very sophisticated for this young woman. Now those of you who've had a little art history, you might think about windows as one of the staples of modernism. Matisse was always painting windows. And artists in the early 20th century were really focused on how can we convey three-dimensional space in a two-dimensional picture plane, sort of kind of flattening of realistic art and creating optical illusions. And when you put the Matisse next to Solomon, I think it's really striking. The formalism, the pleasure of sheer color, the south of France as this sunny, warm, modern place. And then you have this 9-year-old, dealing with her mother's, she's dealing with it at 24, her fall from the window and the end of her life. Another main character in the text I mentioned was this Daberlohn, who represented Albert Wilson, the stepmother's voice teacher. So Paulinka Birnbaum is Charlotte's stepmother. Her father remarries. And then she brings in this voice teacher who becomes Charlotte's first love, so an older man. And if you read the text carefully, there really is a triangle going on where Charlotte feels that her stepmother is sexually involved with Daberlohn, and she becomes involved. And there are many, many works in the full book which show Charlotte trying to please Daberlohn with her art, asking him to pick his favorite piece, asking him to give her a critique, and building up to the physical consummation of their relationship. And her complicated feelings as a young woman in her first sexual relationship. And you also get the feeling for what it was like to be in this household in Berlin in the 20s and early 30s with lots of artists and people from the opera coming and going, writers, people practicing. It was a very exciting time for Charlotte to be in this household. And then, boom, you're hit with the political. The work is split into acts, and at the beginning of the second act, we're bombarded with this image and text, which I've put on the slide. The swastika, a symbol, bright of hope, the day for freedom and for bread now dawns. Just at this time, many Jews, who with all their undesirable efficiency are perhaps a pushy and insistent race, happen to be occupying government and other senior positions. After the Nazi takeover of power, they were all dismissed without notice. Here you see how this affected a number of different souls that were both human and Jewish. So this is Charlotte talking to us, and she is moving in using Nazi rhetoric in a very ironic, mocking way, and subverting Nazi stereotypes of Jews, their undesirable efficiency, and presenting her own role in the culture. And then the last line, different souls that were both human and Jewish. You know, we hear her more, trying to process what these people are doing. The image itself is very graphic, kind of like shorthand, sharp diagonals, a sea of anonymous brown shirts rallying around the swastika, which is held triumphantly. The date mark that Hitler came into power as Chancellor of Germany, January 1st. And the reddish hues alluding to the bloodshed that would follow. But you'll notice that the swastika is actually backwards. So she's subverting it, and this we're going to see throughout the work, which is her way of disempowering the Nazis. And again, she doesn't know fully what's going to happen at this point. All of her family basically lost their status with the rise of Hitler in power. Her father, who I mentioned had been a prominent surgeon and professor, was ousted from his position in the university hospital and could only work in the Jewish hospital. And here he's teaching the other medical faculty about a particular treatment, how to treat this person with an ulcer. And the others say, "Professor Kahn, stop, out." And she's modeling the image off of her incredible knowledge of art history, quoting Rembrandt's The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicolas Tulp. So, thinking about art history throughout this painful process, graphically crossing out the image of her father's operation, the abrupt curtailment of his career. So this is a very powerful image. Her stepmother also lost her status, and she was quite a well-known singer in the 20s. She gave her last public concert, this is Paula Solomon-Lindbergh, with the choir in Leipzig, and from then on could only give concerts organized by the Cultural Association of German Jews in a specifically demarcated Jewish theater. So we have her singing to this tune that's quoted, and then the Nazis in the audience say, "Out, get out." You see the aus, raus, in the top. Charlotte herself, in gymnasium, like high school, telling her father, over and over again. I'm not going to school anymore. Do what you want with me. I'm not going. I've had more than my fill. So she is facing anti-Semitism in the school setting. And her father's saying, you know, just make it through your exams. And if you look at what's going on in this image, we can see the back of a figure by her feet. And then two students, one just to the right of her father and one behind her head. And notice all the abstract marks, presumably made by the teacher and students in the background. And we get these, again, these spiky swastikas in reverse. So in 1935, Charlotte said, okay, I want to go to art school. I can't bear it in the regular high school. And she was one of 1.5% of Jewish students allowed to study in the state art high school. And she would leave in 1937 after a prize that she won and was promised to her was taken away because she was Jewish. There are many, many images of her time in the art school that just fascinate me because they really convey what art students were faced with at this time. They felt a lot of pressure to paint and draw as realistically as possible. And again, if you know art history and modernism, the great artists of this time are becoming more and more abstract. And they're asking her to paint as realistically as possible and rejecting her when she's too abstract. They must bow their heads to Jesus, study the male nude as a vehicle for expressing patriotism, feelings of nationalism and Nazism that came into the teachings. She talks about having to salute Hitler and how the most Aryan-looking girl, student, is constantly praised and how she wants to befriend her. So here the French national anthem is evoked, Allons enfants de la patrie. Like, oh, now I get it. And these were the artists who now we revere as the great German expressionist artists from this period of the early 20th century. Max Beckmann, Ludwig Kirchner, who were moving away from realism, becoming more and more expressionistic, emotional. Beckmann served in World War I, which led him to have a nervous breakdown and questioning his art, and produced nearly 100 self-portraits like the one on the left in different guises where he looks very anxious. And he was labeled degenerate or bad by the Nazis. And this was a whole movement where they ousted German artists from their professions as professors. They took away their work. Ludwig Kirchner also was drafted in the First World War and became very anxious after that. And you see the severed arm here where he's processing what war means. He went to Switzerland and ultimately committed suicide in 1938 after his work was included in the degenerate art exhibit. This was the type of art that Charlotte Solomon would have been taught to emulate. Arno Brecher was Hitler's favorite sculptor, and Hitler was a failed artist. You must know he wasn't admitted into art school, and his first ambition was to become a professional artist. So in sculpture, there was a preference for oversized, cold, muscular classicism, and Brecher made these works that would embody the ideals of nationalism, power, German dictatorship. There were many family scenes of peasant families, farmers, this idea of returning to the soil. And this was the type of work that the art students were asked to copy. Now, I've used the word degenerate art, and in 1937, the Nazis actually staged two exhibitions across the street from one another in Berlin. One of what they call the Great German Art exhibition on the left, celebrated with the image of Pallas Athena, or the Greek heroine of the arts. And on the right, a German-Jewish artist, Otto Freundlich, and his New Man sculpture. So any artist, whether they were Jewish or not, if they were making abstract modern work, they were considered inappropriate. They were considered kind of evoking symptoms of social degeneracy, which were counter to the Nazi ideals. So what do you think happened with one exhibit being labeled good art and one bad? What would you do? You'd see the bad. So people lined up. It was, people were fascinated. And this degenerate art exhibit was restaged in Los Angeles in the mid-90s, and there's an excellent catalog and video if you're interested in learning more about this. So the curators, literally, in the degenerate art exhibit, these are Hitler's curators, hung all the works very close together, made it look really kind of crazy and unattractive, and they labeled anything degenerate that was Jewish, Bolshevik, international, capitalist, distorted, ambiguous, anything that didn't fit into this kind of classical landscape, Madonna, healthy bodies, not diseased ones. They literally likened the modern art of artists like Kiefer, Modigliani, Beckmann to people with physical disabilities. That art itself was pathological by using these clinical photos. So this is clearly coming out of treatises on ethnology and race theory, and condemning these artists, saying that their works mirror reality, which is so far from the original intent. So this is just to give you background for the milieu in which Charlotte Solomon was studying art. So back to her work. After Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass in November 1938, when the Nazis destroyed so many German places of business, her father was arrested and incarcerated in a concentration camp and forced to do heavy manual labor. Eventually, her stepmother was able to get him out. But here you can see this change in her work. Very graphic quality of the image. The faces are no longer identifiable. The physical disparity in size between the officer hovering over him and her father. The violence of the image becoming increasingly angry as human rights are stripped away. This is a very important image in the series. This is the last dinner party that Charlotte attended at her parents' house. And she quotes all the people sitting around the table, realizing, gee, we better leave. There's not much of a future for us here in Germany. And the first person that they would like to leave is Charlotte as a young girl. And so she's sent to Villefranche in the south of France, near Nice, where her grandparents had moved a bit earlier to escape the anti-Semitism. And there she would be more free to paint, but of course she would miss her life, her parents, her lover. And the Nazis were so skeptical of people leaving Germany at this time that her parents asked her to pack up a small overnight bag and take a tennis racket to make it look like she was going on a weekend trip. So what follows in the south of France, there's a series of more happy images than this, but her grandmother ultimately becomes extremely depressed by what's happening politically, and she makes multiple suicide attempts. And it is here in the image on the left that Charlotte documents when she first learned that her mother died of suicide and not the flu. And you can see the word grippe, meaning the flu. And so her grandmother is recovering from one of her suicide attempts, and she's saying, she's telling Charlotte the whole history. So, very violent image on the right, where her grandmother ultimately does succeed in committing suicide. Again, from jumping from a window several stories high. And Charlotte does witness this. So imagine this young artist documenting this incredibly painful chapter of her personal history and of world history. So she's left with her grandfather, and they too are arrested and first sent to a concentration camp in the Pyrenees, like a work camp called GURS, G-U-R-S. And in this cycle of images that shows her relationship with her grandfather, we learn of yet another horrible violation to this young woman. And there's several images where she says they're riding in a train together. She says, just don't force me to sleep in the same bed as him. So her grandfather is guilty of incest and of rape implied through this series. And this starts to get your mind thinking about this whole tragic history of women in this family. This man's first daughter, Charlotte, committing suicide at 18, his wife, people around him, other relatives. And so his role as kind of the patriarch in the family is brought up at the very end of the cycle. And in this particular image, she says, Grandpa, I have a feeling the whole world has to be put together again. And his response, which is so sad, is, oh, go ahead and kill yourself and put an end to all this babble. So he's telling her, okay, complete the cycle. This is the history that was intended for you. And it's just so heavy and unbelievable that she was able to persist and move on. And the very last image of the whole work, Life or Theater, is this one. And this is the most famous one. And she writes, and with the dream-awakened eyes, she saw all the beauty around her, saw the sea, felt the sun, and knew she had to vanish for a while from the human plane and make every sacrifice in order to create her world anew out of the depths. And thus was created Life or Theater. Now, there are multiple ways of interpreting this image, but for me, I think of it as a very positive one, that yes, she's bearing the pain of both her family and the world history on her back, with that graphic Leben oder Theater literally tattooed on her back. She's telling this theatrical tale that is her real life, but she's looking forward. She's looking at the sea, not backward. And for me, it's an image of strength, optimism, endurance. I'm thinking about her name that she chose for herself, Charlotte Kahn. I can do it, I can live, I can create, I can persist. And at this time, she left her grandfather's house. She stayed in a small hotel in Nice. She met and married an Austrian named Alexander Nagler and became pregnant. And the two of them were arrested and sent to Auschwitz, where it's thought that she was murdered shortly after her arrival, because women, and particularly pregnant women and children, were the first victims. So her work is a perfect example of your series theme this year, Myrna, The Lost and Found. I mentioned that she gave it to this Dr. Moridi, who gave the book eventually back to an American woman named Ottilie Moore, who owned the house in Villefranche where her grandparents resided, and to whom the book was dedicated. And eventually her parents did survive the Holocaust. They were in a camp in Holland and then made it into hiding. And they came back to Villefranche, and Ottilie Moore presented them with this book that remained of their daughter. And that was in 1947. In 1959, Albert Solomon brought the book to the director of the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, who was just overwhelmed with the power of this work of art. And he immediately organized an exhibition in Amsterdam, and the next year Israel. A book was published in 1972, and since then the work has traveled and is now in the Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam. So what do we do with this history of Charlotte Solomon, and what is the legacy for us today? I'm imagining that some of you have been to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, and I think you have a speaker coming from there. So this is one of the most famous exhibits in that museum, if you've been there. It's 3 stories high, 1,500 family photos taken between 1890 and 1941 from a small town near Vilno, Poland, which is now Lithuania. donated by a woman, Yafa Eliaf, who's a history professor at Brooklyn College, who was born in the town. And we see all these everyday fragments of real lives, people who lived there. And the professor writes, the only way we can remember the past of Ezeki, that's the name of the town, Ezekski, is through photos. There's no other evidence, no grave sites, no childhood friends, only photos. So all these people were executed. And she wrote a book about this. And the museum decided this would be a beautiful way of bringing these people back to life and having people like us go and interact with the photos in an intensely personal way. But often, in any Holocaust museum, you're also bombarded by these really, really difficult images of the death that occurred in the camps. So juxtaposing ordinary family photos by those that show extraordinary deaths and incredible inhumanity to man, we'd much rather cling to the familiar than attempt to understand this terrifying image. And this was taken by Lee Miller, who was a female surrealist artist in Paris. And she sent this to Vogue magazine. She was one of the people during the liberation who went to the camp of Dachau. And she sent this back with a cable telegram. I implore you to believe this is true. So, I mean, people just didn't fully grasp until these images came out what was happening. Some of the other artists I wanted to show you today were survivors of the Holocaust, inmates who were preoccupied with documenting what was happening to them. They really saw themselves as being able to provide an eyewitness report of what went on in the camps and undermining the German wish for secrecy on the subject. So survivor art and witness reports are very powerful. You see the atrocious living conditions. Theresienstadt was one of the camps built in a Czech town in the Bohemian Hills, and it was considered the, quote, model ghetto, and a town inhabited by Jews and governed by them, in which every manner of work is to be done. That's a quote from the Nazis. And by the end of 45, over 141,000 Jews arrived there from all over Europe. And you can see this very expressionistic style, as you saw in some of the other artists. And there are many wonderful books documenting these artists and kind of what they went through in powerful ways. One of the most important for a class like yours with a theme like Lost and Found is this book called I Never Saw Another Butterfly, Children's Drawings and Poems from Theresian Concentration Camp. And this is an incredible story of how some of the people who were interned, who had an art background, saw it as a mission to give the children in the camps hope by giving them art classes. And one of these, the most prominent, was this woman, Friedel Dicker-Brandeis, who was trained at the Bauhaus Art School in Germany and had a chance to escape Germany and turned it down. She turned down a visa that would have let her go to Palestine because of her sense that she belonged in Europe. And she arrived in Theresienstadt in 1942. And her mission was to bring as many supplies as possible, graph paper, business supplies, anything she could find to help children make art. And they wrote about her as really, one of them wrote, she managed for some hours every week to create a fairy world for us in Theresian, a world that made us forget all the surrounding hardships that we were not spared at our young ages. And this work also managed to survive in dusty boxes like Solomon's and be passed from hand to hand and ultimately ended up in the Jewish Museum in Prague, where you can still see the originals. And there are facsimiles, just as we have with the Solomon exhibit, that travel around the world. And a very famous poem about the butterfly as part of this collection. A child who says, "I never saw another butterfly. That butterfly was the last one. Butterflies don't live here in the ghetto." Another lost and found story I discovered preparing for this lecture was a group of teenage boys living in Terezin produced a magazine in secret. They were between the ages of 12 and 14, and this is another beautiful book narrating their experience as young teenagers. They wrote stories, articles, created illustrations, creating this incredible memento of the horrors of the war, but also the inspiration to keep living. And just the tragedy, what these children could have produced had they survived. And this book is called We Are Children Just the Same. Some of you know Picasso's work, more famous for Guernica, about the Spanish Civil War, but he also responded to the Shoah in this piece called Charnel House. And it looks just like he's looking at these photos of the corpses that circulated in magazines like Life. And this is, again, how so many artists processed the kind of visual assault of the Shoah, just as the reports of death camps began to filter throughout Europe. And the image has a very unfinished quality. You get this still life that looks like it's done in pencil up on the top there. It almost looks like he abandoned the image, that it was too painful for him to completely finish. There's areas that are partially rubbed out, lines, the color seems to bleed. You almost have the feeling of a black and white newsreel. Some of you, if you've been to San Francisco, might know this piece by George Siegel. And there are many, many Holocaust memorials. This is the only one I'm including today. This is at the Legion of Honor Museum in San Francisco, and it was created in '84, and also responds to the imagery that circulated, the photojournalism that circulated, public sculpture. And this is executed in bronze and then painted white, and it's been the subject of a lot of graffiti, which Siegel mentioned that he's comfortable with. He said this isn't a problem because graffiti is a reminder that problems of prejudice have not been solved. And the essential figure of this man standing at the fence is probably derived from a very famous photo by another woman, Margaret York White, who published this in Life magazine in 1945, of the liberation of Buchenwald. And there's another version of Siegel's sculpture at the Jewish Museum in New York. And if you look closely at the figures, you can see he's taking, again, these icons from Western art history, the crucifixion here, the martyrdom of Christ, as a parallel for the martyrdom of the Jews. And this is something the artist Chagall also did as well in his White Crucifixion and other series. So looking at the persecution of the Jews as a crucifixion. Another artist who's very important for you to know about is the German artist, contemporary artist Anselm Kiefer, born in 1945. And there was a large exhibit of his work at SF MoMA last year. And he is referred to as a neo-expressionist, which was a movement in the 80s to kind of return to expressionist painting after all the sort of abstract art of the 60s. And he is very much scrutinizing his German identity and connection to the Nazi past in much of his work, the trauma and memory of coming from this country that produced such a tragedy. And he produces here an interior that's copied from a photo of Hitler's chancellery, his office of state. And a lot of his images do this. He'll show an official building that's now abandoned, decaying. There's fire burning at the center. The destruction of a regime and all the corruptness and atrocities it represents. So this is an example of the next generation of German artists coming to terms with the national heritage and kind of exercising this chapter of history. Now, some people, there's been a lot of critical writing about Kiefer. This is a series that he did in 1969 called Occupations, where he posed in he himself in a Heil Hitler salute wearing paramilitary costumes before historical monuments around Europe. And his intention, as he describes it, was to sort of question the Nazi imagery and, kind of call into question his whole history the history of nationalism. But some people read this work as fascist itself and created a lot of controversy around the reception of Kiefer and what were his true politics. And he's been very reticent about his parents' activities during the Second World War. And one author whose work I read, Brett Kaplan, describes some research that his father was in the German army during the war, became a lieutenant and then captain. So Kiefer trying to process, what is his connection to his parents' generation and specifically to his father's work in the army. And this is more typical Kiefer that we saw in the exhibit in San Francisco, this kind of using materials like straw, emulsions, scattering fragments of real photos, getting at nostalgia, heroic feeling, wings. He'll take symbols from ancient mythology that also refer to German war campaigns. So his work is very beautiful, very large. Look at the dimensions here, 9 feet by 12.5 feet. And has been actively collected by Jewish art collectors, which kind of raises these questions around what are his motives. Another artist processing the Shoah is Shimon Ati, American, born in 1957 in Los Angeles. And he's an internationally known installation artist and photographer. And his work, in particular this series, Writing on the Wall, I found to be very powerful. So he returned to the old Jewish neighborhood in Berlin, and he did archival research, and then he projects slides of people who disappeared, booksellers, butchers, families who lived, shopkeepers who died in the Holocaust, and he projects them onto real buildings. So this is in real time. You walk by and you see these large images. And here, this is an actual family standing in front of, what would have been their home or their shop. And we're asked to sort of understand their past. What is our relationship to them as a disappeared people? Here's another one from this series of a book salesman, a religious book salesman. The photo came from 1930. And the building is just crumbling. The whole neighborhood is now falling apart. And yet it had been such a golden age for Jews in Germany. This is another work that he did in the city of Dresden, where he projected images of Dresden Jews. Here, an image of a Jewish Yiddish newspaper. And you literally walk right over it in the train station. And he is doing a piece in the de Young Museum in San Francisco this spring. That should be interesting. And our final artist to make this contemporary for you is Marina Weinstein, also based in Los Angeles, now in her 30s, but when she did this in her 20s. And looking at the body as a site for working out this issue of cultural memory. So she is an artist whose body is tattooed with vivid scenes of the Holocaust, a hovering angel of death in a gas mask, a row of naked bodies hanging from gallows, gruesome images of Nazi medical experiments performed on children. You can see here details of Auschwitz. You can see the gate on the lower left part of her back, the Arbeit macht frei. See the word free, work makes you free. So she is not a child of survivors, although Jewish, and she is processing this history, she says, and now we are the last of many. and I don't want to forget. And actually, in Jewish law, Jews are forbidden to tattoo themselves because it's considered a desecration of the body. But obviously, many Jews that you know today do have tattoos. So this whole generation of younger people, and this is again Marina Weinstein, are tattooing themselves and observing their Judaism in very unorthodox ways or radical ways. But in this way, remembering and being focused on remembering their ethnicity and their cultural identity. So when Weinstein was in high school, she talks about a woman who was a survivor coming to speak to her. And she says, her talk with the nourishment, she taught me that I could be a survivor too, no matter if it's 1 day or 80 years. And this is a magazine that was produced in San Francisco around the same time, kind of showing the new tattooed Jew, Davka. And she's holding a prayer shawl called a talit over her. So in conclusion, I think that the legacy of Charlotte Solomon in secondary witnessing, or witnessing when you have no prior connection, is a very powerful one. Just looking at the two backs of these young women that are marked with this painful history and oppression, and yet there, I think, is hope that this story will not be forgotten, that young artists, artists of different generations and national origins are committed to teaching us, the public, about this history, that these are public memories, and yes, they're very private memories in Solomon's story as well, but there's a very public message about persistence and the will to live that we need to take home with us. So thank you.